right into today's discussion. I want to introduce our guest, and maybe I'll start there. Our guest is somebody that's been a part of the Product Collective community for a long time. I know she's been at many of our events in the past, and I thought this is the perfect time to have her on for one of these industry interviews, and that's Colleen Grenato. And Colleen, it's awesome to have you here with us.
Hey, Mike, likewise.
And I guess since I asked everybody else, I'll ask you, where are you tuning in from today?
Today, I'm actually in New York, but usually I'm in Orlando, Florida.
All right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, New York, home of the New York Product Conference, which is coming up,
I
which
know,
I know we got
coming
to
up.
hang out at a little bit last year. So
Yes,
awesome.
it was an awesome conference, and April's amazing. So for those of you who haven't seen her speak live, that's definitely a highlight.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Well, I wanted to bring you on in particular because the topic that we're going to have a discussion on, product experiments, and we'll talk about the ins and outs of experiments that we're running when we're product managers and product leaders and what we need to be mindful of. And I know that you've had, well, actually, that was one of the things is I was looking into this topic. I found a conversation that you had on product experiments in the past, and I thought it was a great opportunity to bring you on as a guest. And maybe we could start there. I mean, I guess just kind of starting with the basics. Why do you feel like product experimentation is so important to just the overall process that we find ourselves in as product managers when we're, whether it's launching a new product, trying to extend an existing product? Just what's your take on that?
Yeah, experimentation is so important, and it's one of my favorite topics because I'll admit I learned about it a little bit later in my career. I'm a very analytical person. I'm in my head. I like to think about things, analyze it. And I learned that how you actually learn is through taking action. At a certain point, we can only go so far with analytical thinking and even internal discussions with our colleagues in the office. Eventually, we need to get in front of our customers and see what happens in product specifically. And experimentation allows us to do just that and to do it long before a formal launch where we build and launch and wait and see what happens. We want to do it much earlier. And so experimentation specifically allows us to learn. It allows us to learn through action. It allows us to move faster, to reduce risk, and make better decisions about our product direction. And who doesn't want to do that? So that is why it's become one of my favorite topics. And it also brings a lot of creativity and play into the product development process. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, I can see what you mean by that. I mean, we run experiments at Product Collective all the time. Sometimes they're larger experiments, right? We're going to introduce a brand new event, and so we're starting to get copy in front of people to see how they react. Sometimes it's a small experiment. Sometimes it's as simple as we're sending our newsletter out. What is the subject line? And so maybe like an A/B test kind of an experiment, but kind of make a game of it sometimes, right? So I can tell what you mean by it being fun. When we're thinking of structuring experiments for ourselves as product managers and trying to think through that process, what does that look like? Like when especially if you're trying to structure a robust product experiment, maybe you could kind of start from the beginning there. Like, how should we go through the thought process of that?
Yes. And I think this is so important because there is a thought process behind it. While it is fun and creative, and I'm sure you resonate with this, you're not just like, oh, let's just try this today because I'm really curious what would happen. That's not what experimentation is about. And so I think the first thing that I would say is we need to consider what it is we're trying to learn, that we need to form the basis for the experiment. We need to form a really clear hypothesis about what it is that we're trying to learn, or potentially multiple, if there's multiple components here. And I liken this to the work of a detective. Let's pretend we're all detectives. We just got a mysterious case. We don't just go, I'm going to start forming opinions, right? We first look at everything that we've collected to date. And I would say product managers should do the same thing. I, as a product team, would act like a detective where it's like, what are the insights on this that we already have that might help us form an opinion? What's past research we might have done? What's data that we have available that we can maybe look a little bit deeper into? Have we talked to customer support? Have we talked to marketing, sales, our compliance teams, our other business partners to learn what they know, what they have access to, and all of that? So first is let's go and collect all of this to get our current information, our current opinions, and then dissect that. Let's start looking into it. Let's ask questions about it. What's risky? What do we have low confidence in? What might be wrong here? What do we disagree about? That's a very big thing of like, if there's a point of disagreement, well, the best way to settle that is through an experiment, through learning something and testing it. And we start collecting these insights and thinking about these questions that we have about our insights, and we use those to form our hypothesis or our basis for then going out and experimenting. And without that solid foundation, experiments, I feel like, run amok, but also we don't know why we're doing it. We don't always know what to do with the results. And sometimes we can create more harm than good in terms of damage to the customer experience, but also potentially damage to our reputation as a product team, because a lot of that effort may not be seen as value add, where, you know, we're doing a bunch of research, we're doing a bunch of experimentation, we don't have much to show for it. The next time we want to do it, people might be asking, well, why should we invest this time and money in it? So getting to that basis and that foundation for what we're trying to learn is so important. And the second piece I would say is thinking about the context of where the company and product is as we think about how we're going to design the experiment. So earlier stage companies, earlier stage products tend to have less data. We have less customers. So sometimes some of the quantitative testing may not work as well. For example, if you're really early, it might take you months to get to statistical significance on an A/B test. That's just not worth it. Maybe you can get some early signal, but you have to ask yourself if the data is trustworthy given your state of like what you can collect and how much you're able to collect, given the size of your company. But at the same point, we also have less revenue risk because we have less customers. So maybe we can take action with lower confidence. That might be okay, given the state of our company or our product, because oftentimes we also have a lot more pressure to find something that sticks and to move a lot faster. And so we want to think through, okay, well, what testing might give us the best results in terms of what we're trying to learn? And I do say a really important thing to note is at this point in time, it's also very important to start building up the experimentation instrumentation so that you can start collecting that data. And when you are building the foundation for your hypothesis as well, it's a great time to audit your instrumentation, even if you are more established. At the beginning of any significant initiatives that I've undertook, we first look at the quality of our data around this topic, around the customer behavior, and seeing if there's any tweaks in the instrumentation that we need to do to better set us up for success to measure our progress along the way. And then as companies get later, tend to have more data, we can do more quantitative testing, have more certainty there. But the data generally tells us what is happening, not why. So we still want to bring in qualitative measures there. And we also have something to protect in this case. We have more risk. We have revenue to protect. We don't want to decrease our revenue, right? That's working against our goals. And so, you know, there's different considerations to take into account. It's interesting at this stage, I often see companies I coach over-reliant on quantitative testing, where their primary mode of experimentation becomes A/B tests. And you get a little stuck in just optimizing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we do want to optimize. We want to get the most out of the things that we know are working, but we need to also be thinking about what the next big bet is, what the next innovation is. And generally, you know, the optimization type A/B tests aren't going to give us that signal. So we need to really think about that balance of, you know, what we're investigating and what we're using to learn, so that we are continuing to innovate, thinking about how we can optimize, and also thinking about experiments that are the right technique for the stage of our company or product. And that brings me to the last piece of, okay, we have the basis for what we're trying to learn. We've thought about the context of the company. And now we get creative. And this is where the creativity and the play comes in, is how do we best learn this information? Let's not just lock ourselves into one way of experimenting as a company or as a team. Let's go crazy. Like, how could we learn this in the fastest, cheapest way possible? And we might throw out what feel like wild ideas before we settle on an experiment plan. And I would say that's when we've done it well, because that's when the creative, the really quick moving things that are going to help you learn fast start coming to light. So I would say, yeah, forming that basis for the hypothesis is so important. Understanding the context of your company and what's going to work well to help you learn, so you can have confidence in what you're learning. And then third, getting creative so that we are being innovative, not just in our products, but also with how we think about learning about our products. That will give us a lot more results in our experiments.
That's awesome. That's super helpful. Like I love breaking it down like that because there's a lot to sort of zoom into, which I want to do. I guess before I do that though, just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions for Colleen, submit them in the Q&A because I do want to get to your questions if you have them. But no, all right, let's see where to start.
Where to
You,
go?
yeah, you talked about one of the things you talked about was risk, right? There's some risk that we accept when we're running these product experiments, and we should be mindful of that risk. And I think of things like, well, you talked about the customer experience, right? So we can run an experience or an experiment, but there might be some risk to the customer experience depending on what kind of experiment we're running. How do you sort of balance the short-term need of, wanting to get these data points versus the long-term, goals of your product and wanting to maintain the experience that your customers have come to expect? There's a balance to that. So I guess how do you think through that balance?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And a way I like to frame experimentation is we are not doing things to our customers. It's not science, right? We're not like, doing like lab testing on our customers. What we want to do is create positive experiences for our customers where we can also learn. And I think a great type of experiment that really demonstrates the difference for this is what's called a fake door test. If you haven't come across those before, it's like Uber did this a lot in the early days. So, when Uber was launching rental cars, it started with just a little button in the product that was like, instead of booking a ride, do you want to book a car? And you click on the button and you get to this page and it says, this isn't available yet, but put your email in to be part of our beta, right? Okay, that was a neutral experience. But if you do that to me all the time, I get mad because I'm like, how many times am I going to click on something that's not
Right.
real, right? Like
Right.
you're wasting my time. And also you have a moment of like anticipation there where I'm like, ooh, this is really cool. I'm really interested in this. And you have to be aware that you're potentially creating a moment of disappointment afterwards.
Mm.
And we need to be really careful when we think about this. Goes to balancing the long term of being really intentional. If we're ever going to create a moment of disappointment in our product, why? And is it worth it? And asking that question. Now, a lot of times people are like, oh, well, we can't do this type of testing. And I would say, I very rarely see that being a limitation. It's more about getting creative in how you design it and how you create it so that it is a positive experience for your customer. And maybe it shouldn't be a fake door test, but there's probably another way to learn about it. And this is that balance of, okay, we're not just, again, doing things to our customers. They're not like our in our lab. We are creating experiences where we can also learn, but hopefully also adding value to our customers. And that's where I think you find this balance of thinking about that customer impact and a potential for customer erosion over the long term if the testing is too noticeable, quite frankly. The best testing is happening in the background and you as a customer don't even realize it's happening. And some companies do this exceptionally well. And I would also say that it's really important when we're balancing short term and long term. We need to know what the long term is.
Mm.
If there is no vision, if there is no strategy, and going back, like if we don't have a hypothesis behind the experiment, it's kind of like we're just flailing. We're throwing spaghetti at the wall. We're trying to see what sticks. We're not sure what we're trying to create. We don't really have anything to measure against. And therefore, we're not understanding the choices we are making and how it gets the product closer to the vision or takes away from the vision for our customer. And so I would say that having that really strong vision and strategy to ground us and help us understand why we're doing this to begin with, and then thinking about experimental, like designing the experiment in a very thoughtful way, really thinking about the customer, thinking about the emotions, thinking about the experience that we're creating for our customer. Having those two things are really key to striking that balance.
Yeah. No, that's great. I appreciate that. One of the things I did want to ask you about was when things potentially go wrong with an experiment, right? And I've had, just working with product people, entrepreneurs, there's been some times where people talk to me about an experiment that they ran that they're excited about, and they're like, but we got the data back and, the experiment failed, and they're really down about it. The way I look at it is like, actually, you now have data. You have data that you didn't have before. And
Mm-hmm.
this can push you in the right direction. That's not a bad thing. I'm curious your take on it. You as a product coach and advisor, I'm sure you've seen a ton of experiments. Your time at Airbnb and other places probably been a part
Yeah.
of those. So yeah, what I guess let's talk about failure and how you approach it when it comes to experimentation.
Yes. And I love this topic because if you are not failing, you are not experimenting.
Mm,
Like, say that again, it is core to fail, to experiment, because it's about learning. It's not about, did I get to the right answer? It's about, did I learn? And is that going to get me closer to something that's going to add value for my customer and for my business? And by the way, there isn't just one right answer in most cases. And the way I think about experimenting is a bit like, we have a really strong vision and strategy. If you humor me with a bowling analogy, when we were little, for those of you who've bowled before, there's all the pins at the bottom. You throw the bowling ball down the lane, and when you're little, you can get these little bumpers that they put in the gutter, so your ball never goes to the side. And it kind of keeps you in the game, essentially. And I think about experimentation as a little bit like that. It's like, we're not sure, if we bump up to something, it gives us like clarity of, okay, maybe we kind of tweak the direction we were going into. So it's a little bit like guardrails along the way to kind of help us learn and focus and really refine and get clear on what our strategy is. So we should be failing because we do need to kind of test things out and learn. We're not always going to have the 100% answer. So that is a positive thing. Now, it is a mindset shift, and that's really important to say. And part of this is that, I've had plenty of experiments that haven't gone as planned, probably more so that haven't gone as planned as have gone as planned. I think there's even statistics on this, that at the top companies, like a really small percentage, and by really small, I think it's less than 20, are actually successful experiments in terms of A/B tests and like other types of experiments as well. And I've had that experience as well, where we launch the A/B test, there's no impact, or sometimes we have to roll it back because there's negative impact, or we did usability testing and prototyping, and it just didn't resonate with the users. And two things that I learned were, first, sometimes you need to stick with it. You shouldn't give up too early, because just because that specific test failed, to your point, you are now armed with more information. So what did you learn? Are you going to give up on your hypothesis completely, or are you going to refine or reframe your hypothesis to something different based on what you've learned? And I think that's often the case of, like, if it's something we know that's important, we don't want to give up too early. And there were numerous examples of that at Airbnb, because also some things were really big changes. And even if you didn't get it 100% right, if you got it 80% right, then you just need to tweak it. But that 80% could be a negative result in the beginning. And so it's about understanding that and having a little bit of time to actually refine it and tweak it, while also figuring out how to minimize the downside. So we don't want to just disregard negative experiences for our customers. Maybe we need to roll back. Maybe we need to do an emergency fix and like really have people focused on this and nothing else for a bit. So it's a little bit of decision making there in terms of the urgency and how to minimize any negative impact. But sometimes we need to stick with it and keep going. A specific example of that was Airbnb a few years ago completely revamped the host onboarding process. It needed to be done. It was much simpler. It was very clear and aligned with the vision. The reasons were all there about why this was so important. The initial testing had some negative results, but it wasn't that we needed to scrap this and go back to how it was before. It was that we needed to have confidence that we got it most of the way there. And there were some things that were still a little bumpy that needed to be sorted out. And so we had the time budgeted for that, and we did the work. This was a huge effort across multiple teams, and we got it to where it needed to be, where it was better than what it started out as, and it was better than the past experience as well. And so those things become really important, is having that conviction and sticking with it. And part of that is also managing people's expectations. And then the flip side is you also need to be able to let go. For the ones that are wrong, let them go. Pursue the real opportunities, because the goal of experimentation is to narrow things down, where we start with a whole bunch of things and we zero in on the things that are really fruitful. It's giving us clarity into the things that we should really invest our time and energy into, because those are the things that really have the potential for value for our customers and our business. And sometimes it's just, we don't have the capabilities, the market timing isn't right. There's like other factors that sometimes come in. And if we keep, just not letting go, you're having a huge opportunity cost of what else you could be doing that would be more successful.
Yeah, thank you for all that. I appreciate that. I want to take an audience question here real quick. This is, and there are two questions that came in that are similar to each other, which is, are there tools that might be really helpful in the experimentation process? And maybe at all different stages of it. Maybe it's to manage the hypotheses that you have, to running experiments, to maybe, sharing the results. Just what tools might be helpful for people to know about?
Yes. So I'll start with the quantitative tools because that one's a little bit more concrete of an answer. And that's what I meant when I said instrumentation, where it's essentially your product analytics stack in terms of how you track attribution of how customers come to your platform, how you track the analytics of what they actually do once they're there. Like giving an example at Airbnb, we had very clear analytics that showed us like where our customers came from. If we look at it from the guest side, it's like how people found out about Airbnb, how they went to the landing page, how they searched for listings, what they typed into the search bar for experiences, what common behaviors were in terms of getting to the listing page, heat maps of what people clicked on when they were on the page. Like we had all of that data for us to look at. Now that was a huge part of instrumentation, where it was set up to have the right tracking things set up on the right product pages to collect that data and have it in a repository. This is where partnering with your data analysts, with your data science team is so important. And there's so many products out there that can handle this across a huge gauntlet. I am no longer an expert in that. And to be honest, if you asked me exactly what Airbnb used, I actually don't know for sure, because we did have a mix of custom tools versus things that were built in-house versus things that are available on the market, which is generally the case in most companies, given the specifics of the product. But it's important to kind of do that assessment. And I would start with, what are you trying to collect in your product and why is it going to influence your decision-making? And then doing RFPs and assessing the market, looking at what the top tools are to achieve those goals. And, again, there's any number of these. This is one of the great things about experimentation, is the market has really come much further over the last 10 or so years, and actually having those tools be market available for companies to just plug in and start using. But I would also present a counter answer that you don't actually need any tools, because you could draw something on a piece of paper and put it in front of a customer. Some of our experiments were that simple, of going to Airbnb experiences. We would go to Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco and just start talking to tourists that were there planning their trips, and potentially saying, hey, if we planned a dinner, would you sign up and come? Or something like that, right? And all I needed was myself and going somewhere. Now, I would say another tool that's really beneficial is having a Figma or a tool of sorts to do prototyping, to do wireframes prototyping. That's also a very common tool, so we can do studies that way. And there's a lot of tools that also allow you to do A/B testing beyond in your production. So like usertesting.com, you can load 2 different versions of a prototype and actually do A/B testing on a prototype, which can be really helpful. And that leads me to also, there's a lot of instrumentation as well for you to actually do A/B testing in production, to potentially launch features darkly, which is where they're in production, but your users can't see them yet, or you can choose how you turn them on. A very common thing was we would launch something at Airbnb. We'd start with only 1% of users in a certain host segment, and we'd slowly ramp it up. That tooling and that instrumentation is very important. And again, engineers and your data analysts really help with that. Luckily, when I showed up at Airbnb, it was already mostly built. So it was very easy for us to do those slow rollouts and those launches. I have less experience building that from the ground up. Those are generally kind of technical experiences of getting that in place. But I would say having the goals of having that in place, the ability to launch and do a roll up ramp where you start with 1% and roll it up, the ability to launch darkly where you can have features in production and turn them off and on, the ability to do A/B tests in production so that you can actually track the data, and the ability to actually do the product analytics as well, where you just have that data on a regular basis being tracked so that you have that insight into your product. Those technical toolings are pretty important to be able to do the quantitative experimentation. But beyond that, and this is where I say a lot of earlier companies, they don't have that. And even if your established company doesn't have that, it doesn't stop you from experimenting, because we go back to how I experiment with no tools and or a rough prototype, and we can learn a lot of things that way as well.
Yeah. Well, two things. One, first, I love the reminder of, qualitative data is data too. It doesn't all
Yes.
have to be quantitative. Interviewing customers directly, like going out there at the pier and talking to customers and asking them. I'm sure you got great data. It was qualitative, might not be statistically significant. Not everything has to be, right? So I love that reminder. And then two, for everybody, asking about tools. I'll summarize some of the tools that were mentioned here and add others as well. So when I follow up with everybody, I'll give everybody a little cheat sheet with tools that might be good for experimentation. So I'll get you all covered there too.
Yes.
Colleen,
Thanks, Mike. Because I was going to say
welcome.
I was going to put you on the spot and say, Mike, you actually probably know the tools better at this point, just from hearing from everyone in the community, and also, a lot of the sponsors and vendors.
Yeah, for sure.
Have a lot more insights into that.
No, so I'll put that together. But you look at the clock. This conversation went by so fast, which is, that's how the good conversations. That's what happens, right? So we're coming to the end of our conversation, but we talked about a lot here. If there's one big thing that you want to stick with people, what's that last big takeaway that you hope people get from this conversation?
I would say begin with creativity, not constraints. It's so much easier to come up with all the reasons why you can't do it. Flip that on its head. Start out with how you could. It might feel wild, it might feel crazy. Edit down from there. That's how you get started. If we stick in the constraints, we're never going to get anywhere. So that's a very common thing I do in coaching is flip. Like, if this were possible, what would you do? And then let's figure out how to make it happen, as opposed to starting with all the reasons why we can't. So you'll get a lot more creative things that might be possible.
Love that. I love that. That's a perfect way to end. Colleen, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This was really fun.